Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see you all. Welcome to the CPC Spring Seminar. Today, I am delighted and honored to introduce Patty Valkenburg. She's visiting us from the University of Amsterdam, where she's the professor of children, well-being, and society, and where she has recently been awarded the Academia Europa Award, which is given to European scholars that have had sustained impact and leadership in their field. And Patty certainly qualifies there. She has been an inspiration to the field of media psychology for some time and has certainly inspired the folks here at Stanford. All of the graduate students that are here have just been having an amazing time with her. So please join me in welcoming Patty.
Thank you for these kind words. And I'm so happy to be here. Welcome. Today, and my glasses. Today I'm diving into youth mental health, and I will discuss how social media may be linked to the apparent decline in youth mental health, a topic that is buzzing right now in the US and everywhere in the world. And guess what? I'm also going to reflect on Jonathan Haidt's thoughts on this subject. So let's get started. This is the team behind Project Awesome, which stands for Adolescents, Wellbeing and Social Media. And although we researchers may sometimes conduct complicated and dry research, we are progressively getting better at inventing captivating names for our projects. In Team Awesome, we write about social media use and adolescent well-being, but we also talk with adolescents about their social media use and well-being. And one of the questions that we recently asked them was, can you tell me, what are the long-term influences of social media on you? And what do you think they told us? Let me reveal some answers. Sense of humor. I now know what is funny and what's not. My sense of humor has changed because of the clips I've watched on social media. Self-esteem. I think social media has lowered my self-esteem over the years. Inspiration. I've based my clothing style on social media because I really thought I looked fat. Envy. If someone posts a selfie together with Mo Bicep, I want that too. Do you know Mo Bicep? No. You don't know Mo Bicep? You don't know Mo Bicep? This is Mo Bicep. He is a Moroccan fitness influencer, hugely popular. We are friends. Mo Bicep and I are friends on Instagram. Mental health problems. On social media, you should not compare yourselves with others, but that's easier said than done. I've been seeing a psychologist for a while now. Recent news articles often highlight the decline in youth mental health, and a growing number of those articles blame social media as the cause of this effect. And I just showed you a quote from a girl, but she was not the only one. Some girls and boys also, they admit that they get depressed because of social media. And not only journalists, but also academics blame social media for this decline. Here's a quote from John Haidt in The Anxious Generation. There was little sign of an impending mental illness among adolescents in the 2000s. Then, quite suddenly, in the early 2010s, things changed. Between 2010 and 2015, the social lives of American teens moved largely onto smartphones with continuous access to social media. This is the single largest reason for the tidal wave of adolescent mental health. Are these claims warranted? And that's the question I aim to explore today. Let's first explore the rise in mental health problems across years. Here you see the rise in adolescent depression from 1948 to 1989. This represents the earliest study that I could find. The increase in depression levels during this period was 10%. And here is another study among American youth that shows the increase in depression and anxiety in the period after the previous one. Here you see an even more serious increase of 56%, which is most prominent between 2003 and 2007, when phones were still hardly available. In this study, the increase is mostly due to the increase in anxiety and less to the increase in depression. Multiple explanations exist for this early decline in mental health of young people as of the 1960s. I recently collected 15 explanations, 15 potential causes, and for now I will only mention a few important ones. The decline in religions and the subsequent rise in individualism, which have led to a loss of clear frameworks, a loss of purpose, and a loss of sense of belonging. The increased education, the increased emphasis in wealthy societies on extrinsic goals, such as status and success, that may have resulted in increased educational stress among young people, which is an important predictor of mental health issues. The decline in free play. Through free play, children learn to give and take, deal with stress and frustration, and become assertive, which may inoculate them against mental health issues. I've saved one of the most important explanations for last, and that's Nick Haslam's concept creep hypothesis. And that hypothesis argues that more and milder types of mental issues are progressively considered as mental health problems. Let me give an example. In 1952, the DSM-1, the Handbook of Psychiatrists, listed 106 mental illnesses, while the current DSM-5 lists over 300 mental illnesses. And that's an example of horizontal concept creep. Another example, the growing conflation of sadness with a cause with sadness without a cause. And sadness with a cause is, for example, sadness as a result of grief due to a loss. But sadness without a cause is depression. And recognizing this distinction is crucial, particularly for young people, for whom occasional sadness is normative. Adolescent. Conflating normative sadness with depression is an example of vertical concept creep. Now, let's turn to the most recent period. These data are from the National Study of Drug Use and Mental Health, and they deal with the percentage of youth who had experienced a major depression in the past year. From 2004 to 2010, the percentages were rather stable. But from 2010 onwards, these percentages more than doubled. The sharpest increase, as you see, was during the COVID-19 period, an 18% increase in 1 year, which recovered somewhat afterwards. These data strongly suggest that the decline in mental health has accelerated in the past decade, from 10% to 55% to 117%. What are the causes of this acceleration? Again, multiple explanations exist, of which I will mention a few. Please note that the previous explanations did not disappear. These explanations just built upon the previous one I mentioned. Increased mental health problems among parents, the millennials and the Gen Xers, who as we have seen in the previous slides, also suffer from more mental health problems. Concerns about the future, climate, housing, etc., etc. COVID-19, the pandemic, in that year we saw the sharpest increase. And of course, social media, news, hate, perfect pictures, doom scrolling, etc., etc. But again, there's another important explanation which I've kept for last, and that's the prevalence inflation hypothesis, coined by Folks and Andrews. This hypothesis points to the boomeranging effects of the ever-growing mental health awareness raising initiative in the past decade. School programs, university workshops, and media campaigns have all progressively embraced initiative to raise mental health issues, to raise mental health awareness. And, for example, celebrities like Lady Gaga, Halle Berry, Prince Harry, all openly speak about their mental health struggles. And on TikTok, you see lasting hashtags like therapy speak, which further bring mental health issues into daily conversation. And these actions, which all happened in the past decade, aim to destigmatize mental health issues, but they often inadvertently normalize them instead, resulting in an increase rather than a decrease in mental health issues. Let me now show you an intriguing example of prevalence inflation. This graph, included in Jean Twenge's book Generations, vividly illustrates how increased awareness can influence perceptions of societal issues. The upper curve indicates that the percentage of college degrees awarded to women has increased by about 25% since the 1980s. According to Twenge, women receive now 60% of all college degrees. But now look at the lower curve that represents the percentage of teens who believe women face discrimination in obtaining a college education. Like mental health problems, as of 2010, this percentage has more than doubled. Twenge attributes this sharp increase to awareness-raising movements such as the Me Too movement. But what this graph strongly suggests is the following. When gender discrimination receives public attention, teens' perception of gender discrimination become inflation. Similarly, when mental health issues receive more public attention, teens' perceptions of mental health issues may become inflated. Sounds interesting, right? Sounds interesting. To conclude, the decline in mental health did not suddenly start in the early 2010s, as hate suggests, but the evidence does suggest that due to a sizable expansion of causes of explanation, it did accelerate in the past decade. I've mentioned 10 causes which may all have contributed to this decline. And in the remainder, I will focus on the specific role of social media in this decline. By the way, this suboptimal slide was created in ChatGPT 4 after 20 failed attempts to create an accelerating curve. Now let's turn to social media. As I've shown, our qualitative results clearly indicate that each adolescent is different. Social media can make some adolescents happy while leaving others feeling depressed. However, these are qualitative findings, and we must admit that qualitative research has greatly contributed to our understanding of the striking differences in adolescents' responses to social media. So why don't we all go qualitative? Why don't we all go qualitative? I think the answer is simple. Some of us prefer to compute p-values and confidence intervals when examining theories, and some of us want to quantify and generalize to target populations. And in the remainder of this presentation, I will demonstrate our quantitative approach to investigating individual differences in adolescent susceptibility to social media use. To explore these individual differences, we employed a so-called measurement burst design among 388 adolescents. We collected more than 250 repeated measurements from each individual adolescent. And such a large number of repeated observations is necessary to investigate person-specific effects, in this case of social media on well-being. Investigating person-specific effects means that we can compute an effect size of the impact of social media on well-being for each individual adolescent. Our design consisted of 16 bi-weekly surveys and 2 3-week experience sampling bursts in which we asked adolescents via their phone questions about their well-being and social media use. During the second ESM burst, we tracked adolescents' app use using the Ethica ESM app. And at the end of the study, we collected their Instagram archives to get an impression of the content they shared and encountered during the study. I'm now presenting the results of our first ESM study, and here you see Kitty, one of our participants, and her fluctuation in social media use and well-being across 3 weeks, 126 measurements. The yellow line represents her overtime fluctuations in well-being, and the green, red, and blue lines represent different types of social media use, such as sending messages and snaps, active social media use, or browsing or scrolling passive social media use. And in the remainder of our presentation, I will focus on passive social media use, called scrolling, because it's the most common type of social media use among adolescents, and because this type of use has repeatedly been hypothesized to lead to a negative effect on well-being. There's even an hypothesis for this effect, the passive social media use hypothesis. We assessed adolescents' affective well-being by asking them to indicate how happy they felt at the moment of the ESM notifications. We used dynamic structural equation modeling DSEM to analyze our data. DSEM is a Bayesian modeling technique that combines the strengths of multi-level analysis, structural equation modeling, and N-of-1 time series. With DSEM, you can investigate, again, the longitudinal effect of social media use for each person individually. And as I said, this leads to a separate effect size for each individual participant. Let's first have a look at the average longitudinal association of scrolling and well-being. And here you see Kitty again, together with Adrian and Jeff. As you see, we did not find any average longitudinal effect of scrolling on well-being. And this result is actually in line with several recent studies that investigated the longitudinal association of social media use with well-being. They mostly find null or only very small effects of social media use on well-being. But let's now look at the person-specific or N-of-1 effects for Kitty, Adrian, and Jeff. As you see, Adrian experienced a strong negative effect of social media use on well-being. Kitty experienced no effect. And Jeff experienced a strong positive effect. Lucky Jeff. Now let's further delve into our person-specific findings, which offer two important advantages. First, we can do more specific hypothesis testing. We can investigate for how many participants does a certain hypothesis hold. And we can also do more precise moderating effects. We can investigate for how many participants does a moderator effect hold. Let me start. Let me ask you, What do you think? For how many adolescents does the passive social media hypothesis hold? I'm not going to ask you. Do you have an idea? For how many adolescents does the passive social media use hold? Who dares? Let guess.
89%.
59?
No, 89.
89%? Okay, let me review. This histogram shows the distribution of longitudinal person-specific effect sizes across all participants. And you see the x-axis shows the range of the effect sizes. And the y-axis, shows the number of adolescents who experience an effect of a certain magnitude. And these effect sizes ranged from minus 0.20 to 0.27. Let's now look at the green bars at the left. These are the negative effect sizes that were consistent with the passive social media use hypothesis. The passive social media use hypothesis was confirmed for 20% of adolescents, and this confirmed for 80% of adolescents. 20% even experienced the positive effect of social media. So altogether, we see that 20% of adolescents matched the theoretical explanation, while 80% did not do so. And as you may remember from your science philosophy classes, for Karl Popper, only one single observation that does not confirm the hypothesis is enough to reject this hypothesis. Let's now turn to the next type of result, more specific testing of moderators. A crucial question is, of course, why adolescents differ in their susceptibility to the effects of social media. Now, review studies agree that adolescents who are vulnerable offline are also vulnerable online. I'm talking about anxious adolescents or uncertain adolescents, or adolescents with a high tendency to compare themselves to others, and who are more sensitive to others than others to environmental influences. In our N of 1 moderation analysis, we investigated several moderators. For now, I focus only on social media-induced envy, because envy is the mechanism of the passive social media use hypothesis. The idea behind this hypothesis is that social media use, passive social media use, scrolling leads to upward social comparison and envy, which in turn negatively affects well-being. So, we indeed found a small negative effect of envy, of social media-induced envy, minus 0.13. And a moderating effect of this size is actually quite common in the social sciences. But what does it actually mean? What does a moderating effect of this size actually mean? Let me show you. First, we looked at how many adolescents became envious due to their scrolling. We found that 56% of adolescents sometimes get envious due to scrolling, and 44% did not experience such envy. And then we examined how many adolescents among those who experienced social media-induced envy experienced a negative effect on their well-being due to this scrolling. And we found that 25% of the envious adolescents experienced a negative effect on well-being, while 75% did not. But let's now compare these results to those of the adolescents who did not experience social media-induced envy. You can see that the pattern is not very different. Among these adolescents, 13% experienced a negative effect on scrolling on well-being, while 87% did not experience such an effect. So we see here that a common moderator effect of minus 0.13 for social media-induced envy leads to 12% more adolescents who experience the negative effect of scrolling on well-being. That's interesting, right? That leaves a lot to explain to other moderating effects. These are our findings. Both our qualitative and our quantitative studies indicate that on average effect sizes, one average effect size of social media use on well-being doesn't fit all. Across our studies, all of our studies in the past year, we can conservatively conclude that social media may be a source of happiness for approximately 10% of adolescents, while acting as a trigger for unhappiness for another 10% of adolescents. But now you may be wondering, what's the relevance of these results? And before I provide you with an answer, let me ask you, who here believes they represent the average person? No? Jeff, are you the average person? No, not the average person. Are you the average person? Are you the average person? I'm also not the average person. Consider this. Less than 9% of our respondents experienced the average null effect of scrolling on well-being. That's reported in so many studies. Less than 9% scored the average null effect. That's interesting, right? Now, I'd like you to take a moment to consider prevention and intervention programs. Our knowledge is of tremendous importance for the development of such programs. After all, if practitioners were to base their programs on average results, they might conclude that such programs are unnecessary, because most studies, including our own, report no or very small effects of social media use on well-being. Our results clearly indicate that social media use negatively affects a minority of young people. Let's now examine some figures. The US approximately counts 75 million youths. So if 10% of these youths experience a negative effect of social media use on their well-being, we are talking about 7.5 million US youths. These are percentages that we need to take seriously, right? Although small, even percentages of 10% can contribute to the acceleration of youth mental health problems. Next, of course, next to the other important causes of the decline in youth mental health that I discussed earlier. And an important next step, of course, is to investigate how social media use contributes to the decline in mental health. Is it because the abundant therapy speak on TikTok, for example, that normalizes and inflates mental health scores? Or are the astute algorithmic recommender systems responsible for targeting vulnerable kids with information that perfectly appeals to their specific vulnerabilities? Or do both hypotheses hold, but for different kids? These are very important questions for future research. For now, I would like to end with a fitting quote by Todd Rose. We have a bright future before us, and it begins where the average ends. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patty, for that take. I have many questions, but we also have a really full room. So I'll start, but let's people can put their hands up when we get started so we can address as many questions as people have. I want to come back to the last thing that you said there about algorithms designing for specific vulnerabilities. One thing you've talked a lot in your career is about content. And that was a little bit not part of this. And you know, you were focusing on psychological moderators. How do you think about the content aspect of this? That is that each of us have our own media streams now, and that a lot of that variance could be accounted for by the kind of media experience we're having? Or do you feel like that's only one piece of the puzzle and this psychological part is the other important piece?
I think content is crucial. Content is crucial, and I didn't present it in our study. We also try to investigate content. We investigate happiness and sadness in DM messages in Instagram. But the thing is that if you investigate content, you often have to turn to objective content, for example, by analyzing the archives of the social media platforms. But the thing is that we did not find an average effect either of content. And the point is that everyone experiences content differently. So although investigated content is much more important than investigated just time spent on a social medium, what everyone does, because it's so difficult to access content, but even content and then objective content can lead to quite different reactions.
Yeah.
So you always have to combine the experience to the content with the objective content if you investigate effects.
Right. And this has been the real struggle, is that you look at something that could to one person look upsetting, be to another person very exciting and positive. So it can't just be content, it has to be your interaction with it. Yeah. I want to rely a little bit and take advantage of your deep knowledge of media. And my sort of understanding of these questions that were brought up by TV in the 70s and 80s, and then about video games in the 90s, is that there was a similar sort of distribution of effects, and people weren't really doing N-of-1 approaches or multi-level modeling. But could you tell us, in your sense, you know, you were doing a lot of the work then, does this look different when we look at the distribution of effects and that idea of like maybe everybody's different? Is this pattern different than what we observed in the 70s and 80s for TV, or a pattern with video games in the 90s?
Let me say the debates on the effects are not very different, but we are now so much better in doing research. And that is different, because when I started, most studies were cross-sectional. Almost all studies were cross-sectional. Survey studies, cross-sectional, only one survey at one time. But now we have multi-level analysis. You cannot get published anymore with a cross-sectional survey. Just one survey is not enough. So we have all kinds of new methodologies and more granular insights. I think that has changed. But the debate, the debate is. There's always, even the fierce debate is on computer games, on violence, and the effect of computer games on violence, on aggressive behavior. That was really, among scientists, there was a huge debate, and even with ad hominem arguments.
Yeah.
So that's not new.
Right.
Because we now have it again a bit with social media. There's a camp that says it has huge effects, and there's a camp that says, okay, tiny effects. But we are talking about the same effect sizes. It's not the effect size that's debated, but how to interpret the effect size. That's what differs between academics.
Right. Great. Thank you. All right. Questions from the room?
Thank you so much for your presentation, Patty. If you could expand a little bit more on you asked a question in the beginning that left me puzzled. You say, are we looking at an increase in mental health concerns, or is the increase in mental health correlated to the awareness that we have of mental health problems arising in teens? So if you want to elaborate a bit more, I would love that. Thank you.
I think that these are two causes. The first is the concept creep, but there is evidence that we have broadened our definition of mental health, that you can see that from the handbook of psychiatrists, that there are many more mental health problems acknowledged right now. But that's not the main cause. But what I try to say is that I presented 10 causes, but I can also present 20 causes, because there's a huge literature on the decline of mental health. But I didn't want to bore you with 20 causes. And this prevalence inflation, that's something that happens in the past decade. But we also see an increase. And I thought when I was reading Jean Stwenger's book, and I saw this on gender discrimination, I thought this is exactly what is also going on with mental health. But that's not the main cause, but it's one of the causes, because important societal problems never have one cause. They have always multiple causes, right?
How do we deal with that fact? Like, so as you were just saying in the previous answer, our subjective experience is really important, right? Like that's the ground truth of how I am doing. And so how do we account for changes in that reporting if we have this creep in order to make these sort of longitudinal assessments over time? Is there a way to take into account the concept creep, certainly the vertical one?
That's a difficult question. Because in so many ways, studies that we conduct now are incomparable to studies that we did 10 years ago. Because I'm now involved with a longitudinal study, a 10-year longitudinal study with a Norwegian group. But how can we compare the social media environment of 10 years ago with those of this year? So what I think, it makes no sense to compare with earlier studies, because everything has changed. Also the social media, especially the social media environment has changed.
Yeah, for sure.
And I would not recommend doing long-term research into the effects of social media as of now, because we don't know what happens in 2 years. The study I just showed was done just before the COVID pandemic. But then we did a national survey into the most popular platforms among youth, and it was in the Netherlands, WhatsApp, Instagram, and Snapchat. But now it's TikTok, and it's only a few years later. So, and TikTok has a completely different, which is now copied by Meta, but it's a completely different social media environment than 3 or 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We have a question here.
Thank you so much, Patty. I was just wondering if you think that the results would be different if the study was also including youth from third world countries, or in refugee camps, or youth that are in war, countries at war. Would it be drastically different? Would it be, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, these are very specific circumstances, and I actually don't know the answer on it. I must say that our second ESM was during the school lockdowns, and that was also a very different period for kids, because they were at home. But in some respects, yeah, the social media use went up, of course, at that time. But there was not much, there were huge individual differences in well-being, of course, but that was also strange, because what we heard from the kids, some kids benefited from the lockdowns. Some vulnerable kids, they liked it, actually. So it's so difficult to say. On average, you can find no differences, but if you talk with the kids, then you do find the differences. They experience even some things as a lockdown so differently.
Yeah, it's so difficult to tell the difference there.
Thank you for your presentation, Patty. You just suggested to not do longitudinal research anymore, to look at changes in mental health. So I'm just curious, there's so much interest in doing this type of work. So what are your suggestions for researchers?
I cannot hear you.
Oh, is it on? So what are your I just thank you for your presentation, and I listened to your suggestion of not doing any longitudinal research anymore. So what would you recommend researchers who are interested in this area? What type of studies should they do to move beyond the screen time and the scrolling incorporate the person's specific idea, but then, what should we do?
Yeah, I didn't mean to say that I would advise no longitudinal studies. I'm very much in favor of longitudinal studies, but 10-year longitudinal studies on social media use is useless because you can predict that the social media environment is a moving target. And if you want to investigate effects of a moving target, if something that's changing in itself is used as the factor that predicts an effect, that's impossible.
Right, right.
And it's invalid. That's what I mean. But I do, I would say, shorter-term longitudinal studies. For instance, with periods of 3 months. And we are currently doing, we have just finished a 100-day diary study that gives more insight in experiences. So every evening, via their phones, adolescents filled out a short diary with some open questions and closed questions. And then you can follow them for 100 days. And that gives a wealth of information. But these are the techniques that we can use now due to, and we can investigate adolescents through their phones.
I think Kevin Munger called this an issue of temporal validity, that the media environment is changing so rapidly that we need to think about that. But what's kind of interesting there, if I think back to our meta-analysis, looking at these sort of average effect sizes, and I understand none of us are average, they don't really seem to change that much, despite the fact that the media, and social media in particular, is really changing quite a lot over time. Could we learn something from that sort of non-change?
That's a difficult question. What do you think?
Well, it makes me suspicious that there's a strong effect there. But we've had a number of people come in where we've sort of discussed this small or minimal effect. And we had the authors of the Science and Nature papers that looked at Facebook and where they changed the algorithms pretty substantially, and see in that period of time, which is 6 weeks, 20,000 people, not much change. And so one question that we've been struggling with here is like, well, how could you conclude that there's no effect? And one concern there is that perhaps the effect is small, but we've been doing it for so long that looking at something for 6 weeks, even with 20,000 people, you're completely underpowered to see something. So I'm coming back to like, how do we make a decision about there being no effect, or about limiting what we think the size of the effect is? And I think it's a real struggle because of the amount of time we've been using this system.
Yeah, the thing is that we must admit that we have never been completely be able to measure media use optimally, never. Because if we investigate the news, then we ask how much time did you spend with this news source, with that news source. So it's always simple questions, because more difficult questions are impossible in survey-like studies. So if we don't affect, it can also be because we have suboptimal measures of media use, and you cannot blame researchers for these suboptimal effects because there's no alternative. We do our best. It's all we can do.
It's like you're perfectly setting up a question from somebody in the screenomics domain.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm also struck by the notion of longitudinal studies being difficult to interpret, because the same argument that you're making about social media could be made for mental health also, which you made, that the definition of mental health has changed dramatically over the last 50 years. So that suggests that even the graphs which you showed at the beginning are actually not relevant as well.
So we have an independent variable and a dependent variable that constantly changes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's fun.
You make it more difficult.
I'm also curious on the notion that the average person does not exist. I really like this because I'm highly invested in the person-specific approach. How about the average day? Your models are making an assumption about equivalence across all the days, that they're equivalent or interchangeable. Does there also exist an average day? Is today an average day?
Yeah, but that's interesting, because what you see, and I want to investigate this in the 100-day diary study. I'm very curious, and we call it the set points of each adolescence, the set point in well-being. I mean, the fluctuations across in the ESM and the 100-day diaries, they fluctuate around one's own mean. But it's interesting to compare these different set points across adolescents, because each adolescent, in person-specific research, each adolescent has their own mean across all the observations, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you can also investigate 100 days. You can. What's the set point in the first 10 days? What's the set point in the second 10 days? But you should be able to investigate that, right?
Well, another time question from the Zoom attendees at a much bigger scale, which is around age. We know adolescence is a time of pretty substantial change, even within a year, maybe week. So one of our guests has asked about your opinions on age restrictions, some of which, you know, John Haidt has proposed as well. Do you have a take on that, given the person-specific approach?
I don't know enough the American context, but in Europe that would be difficult, because we have ratified the UN Right of the Child Convention, and children have the right to voice their opinion on social media, and children have the right to form friendships on social media. So you cannot just ban social media. And my idea is, but this is what I do think, that platforms can do more to protect kids. I see constantly that moderation is too little and too late. And I think that in Europe we have a law, the GDPR is the privacy law, that forbids profiling for minors. It happens all the time. It still happens all the time. So there are so many more measures that we could do to protect children, and it should start where the problem begins, and that is at the platforms. But a total ban would be impossible. And I'm also, in the Netherlands there is currently a ban in schools for phones. There's a phone ban in schools, and I'm in favor of that, because in my career I've never found a big effect. Never average effect. But I did find such an effect for distraction. The effect of social media use on distraction is the largest effect that I've ever found in my career. and so
it's so weird, because students at Stanford never are distracted in my classes. They're just always paying attention to me. They never look at their phones. Great. Okay, we have a question over here. Matt?
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much. I really agree with you about the importance of heterogeneity here, and I guess one thing that stands out to me in this domain is from qualitative or anecdotal evidence, at least, the extremes of the distribution of effects seem like they could be quite large. So we have examples like suicide and eating disorders, and cases where a small number of kids we know seem like they might at least have been affected in really, really harmful ways. And so I guess the question would be, one, do you think this kind of high-frequency longitudinal measurement framework is able to pick up those tail effects? And then I guess a second one would be, one view somebody could have is those on their own are enough to suggest we should be very cautious about this. And I guess part of what you would wonder is, are there countervailing tail effects on the other side? So I wonder if in your qualitative research you have a sense of, you know, examples where a small number of kids might have experienced really large, substantial benefits, so that if we're reducing or shutting this down, we might be really, really harming those kids.
Yeah. These were several questions. First question is, this is not a study that can capture long-term effects. And so this is one of the kind of studies, and my observations, I've done different types of studies and review studies. I mean, only in the past 4 years, I retraced 27 review studies and meta-analysis on this topic. So there is a huge number of different types of studies, and I think the conclusion should not be on this study, but on the whole corpus of study, and that's in the hundreds of studies have been appearing in the past years. And about the tails for well-being are on both sides. And for example, if you compare that with the effect of social media use on distractions, you don't see these tails. They are all positive, the relationships. I wanted to show that, the forest plot, but it's a completely different situation. There is much less variance in the effects. So it depends on the outcome variable, and well-being is apparently an outcome that leads to a lot of variance in the effects, very negative ones and very positive ones.
Hi, Patty. Thank you for your talk. Among the negative effects that I can see of mental health from social media would be cyber stalking, cyber bullying, and cyber shaming. I was wondering how many of those effects did you study specifically, if any?
Not in this study. Absolutely not in this study. And to investigate cyberbullying, that's a whole line of research with other expertise than we have, because that's other questions, other scales. And so, I mean, we all know that cyberbullying is a serious situation. Although recent reviews, they say that offline bullying still occurs twice as often than online bullying. But that doesn't make it less serious, because the thing with cyberbullying is that it happens even when kids are at home while father is cooking. They can be cyberbullied when they are at the table waiting for the dinner. So it is a serious problem. And we did not measure that in this study.
Question from online here is, how do you account for John Haidt reaching the alternative conclusion? He's a smart guy and must be aware of the awareness effect, although I'm not sure. So why the alternative interpretation? And what, if anything, would be the best argument for his position? So I guess, just to put it simply, why do you think he reaches the other alternative conclusion?
I think it has to do with what I just said. We all know the effect sizes, and you cannot lie about effect sizes, but you can differ in the interpretation of effect size, and that is also, that's not new. What I just said, that happened also at the time that the huge discussions were about the effects of computer games on aggression. You recognize that also. You
right. Yeah.
That's so. It's something that happens all the time. That different academics have different views on the same effect size.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Over here. Byron?
Yeah. Thank you, Patty. My question is about that last 10% figure in one of the last slides, and whether it's 20 or 30 or 5, I'm not that interested in that, but I'm interested in your advice based on that number in our investment in within versus between characteristics and strategies, as a field here. So my take is that 90% that's not showing anything is probably the 90% that Jeff and his colleagues used in the national academies to come up with this notion that there is no population level influence of media on mental health. Why not just get those folks to the side and concentrate as a field on those 10%? I mean, obviously you have to go through some procedure to find out who those are, but then invest in the within longitudinal granular details, mechanism testing that in the within. So it's not an either or. Both are important. It's good to know that it's 10 or 12 or 20 or whatever it is. But the evidence so far is that it's not the majority. And so finding a way to relax on those folks, keep an eye on them, but relax on those folks and concentrate investment and money and time. And publication credits to look at those, to focus more on that 10%, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, both would be great. But advice on investment.
I think that's a great suggestion, Byron. I think we should focus more on these 10%, focus more a specific study on vulnerable kids, although you need to have a procedure, a research procedure to identify these kids. And the point is, it's so complicated because my idea is, over the years that I've done research, that you have to identify kids based on moderators. That is the susceptibility variables in more popular terms. But I think that kids differ in the moderators that affect them. For one kid, it's maybe the context that counts, and for another, it's disposition that counts, and for another, is again something else. You know what I mean? It's very difficult to identify this vulnerable group, and maybe you should start
the
with
70 million kids that show nothing are getting in the way. They're kind of clouding the scene.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
It's actually 68 million. Byron, let's get our math straight, okay? You're right, 67.5. Yeah, great. Are there any other last questions in the room? Because then I have our classic CPC question. Well, there's two, really. You're at Stanford. It's 2024. We haven't talked about AI yet. So do you see a role for AI here in either advancing the way we can do research or on some of the solutions that might be able to help personalize this?
I do see a huge role in computational science. And we already use it, although I'm not an expert, because what I told you about the happiness and sadness, that was based on an analysis using BERT topic, and that's a neurotopic modeling approach. But I do see for communication scholars, and we in Amsterdam, we are, not me, but my colleagues are pioneers in that respect. And I do see lot of advantages for communication scholars to use AI techniques to analyze media use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
because we have more access to archives, social media archives, and they can be analyzed. We are currently trying to do it with TikTok data downloads, TikTok archives of the kids.
Right, and we have Samid and Dave here who are developing a content moderation pipeline that could be useful both in research, but also saying, okay, this is a kid. Let's change the moderation policies here in a fairly serious way where that could get at that content side of the equation for us. So I think there's a lot of excitement there. Last one, since we're at the Cyber Policy Center, do you have thoughts from your European perspective, and I know you know the GDPR really well, but thoughts on how we should be talking to or thinking about policy, given your person of one approach, that you could share with policymakers that may be listening?
I think I already said something about it. I think that social media, the current generation of platforms has lost the relative innocence that platforms had 10 or 15 years ago. And I think that platforms now can undermine the agency of vulnerable groups. And I used to be very nuanced and very positive, but now I'm more concerned about the effects of social media on vulnerable kids, because what I just said, I think because of AI-based recommender systems, vulnerable kids can be targeted via their vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's a serious question. So I think we need to force platforms to moderate their content in time and to protect minors with all kinds of tricks to keep them glued to the screen.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Please join me in thanking Patty. Join us next week for Olivia Blasey, who's coming from the École Polytechnique, and we'll be talking about online age verification, so very relevant to what we're discussing just now. And that will be moderated by Florence Giselle, because Nate and I will be